Good morning, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Joint Digital Economics Seminar. So this is a new series organized by a few institutions around Europe. In Paris, we have the IMT Business School Paris, University of Paris-Saclay, and Telecom Paris. Then we have the Louvain Economics of Digitization and the DETAP Lab of the University of Padua. Now, that's new, but it's also a relatively old seminar series since we started to organize joint online seminars last year, and we decided to continue. So we believe that the community of scholars that was created and followed the series was indeed one of the good effects of social distancing, and we decided to continue with one meeting per month. So we will start today and we continue until December for sure, and hopefully in 2022. So we are extremely happy to have a great scholar launching the Joint Digital Economics Seminar, Garrett Johnson from the Questrom School of Business, Boston University. He's an assistant professor there, and well, among other topics, let me say that he studies online display advertising and privacy issues. And in fact, today we will talk about regulating privacy online. Now, we keep the same format we used last year. Okay, so we have Garrett presenting for 45 minutes and then a QA session for 15 minutes. So if you have clarification question, Garrett already told me that you could interrupt, but please also feel free to write them in the chat, and then Leonardo and I will stop Garrett sometimes. Yeah. And now for more substantial question, of course, we can use also the QA session after the talk. So without further ado, welcome again, Garrett. The screen is yours. You have 45 minutes. So thanks a lot.
OK, c'est un grand plaisir d'avoir la chance de présenter mes recherches sur l'RGPD. L'auteur principal ici, c'est Sam Goldberg, qui est un étudiant doctoral à Kellogg, qui est présentement au marché de marketing. L'autre auteur, c'est Scott Shriver à l'Université de Colorado à Boulder. Et nous avons deux projets portant au RGPD. Le premier, ça porte aux concurrences, et c'est très complémentaire aux présentations que vous avez eues l'année dernière de Christian Pukert. Mais celle-ci porte au l'effet de RGPD au site web. So now that I've got a few smiles out of you, I will switch to English. It is a real pleasure to be able to present to a European audience, given that this is a European regulation, and this is a part of your daily lives. So I guess at the core of this is a tension that we have between the data economy and privacy regulation. Certainly as someone that is in marketing, I think of this very much in terms of digital marketing. And in digital marketing, identity is incredibly important because it powers the ability to target users and to measure the effectiveness of advertising and subsequently optimize the advertising. And I think the targeting part gets probably the most play in the public discussion about this, but the measurement and optimization pieces are also incredibly important and go away when you start to get rid of the ability to know who a person is across contexts. So as I say, privacy concerns are starting to challenge this operating model, and the giant domino to fall here, the first domino to fall here is the GDPR. That has, I guess, emboldened tech platforms to start to enact changes on their platforms that affects how the rest of the industry is able to play in this advertising space. So we've got Apple has been blocking third-party cookies for a long time. They are, I guess it's no longer pending. They are currently harshly restricting the identifiers to their mobile phones for advertising purposes. And Google is saying that they're going to sunset the third-party cookies in 2022. In fact, that may have been extended to 2023 because it turns out that re-architecting an entire industry is a very difficult thing to do. So the question that I have today is, what is the impact of the GDPR on websites, traffic, and e-commerce revenue? This is specifically for Europeans. And the data set we have to answer this is really quite cool and exceptional. We are able to look at 1,084 diverse firms and their analytics dashboards through Adobe Analytics. As I mentioned at the beginning of the talk, the lead author of this paper is Sam Goldberg, who actually spent quite a bit of time at Adobe and was able to gain access to data there. So they've been outstanding partners. And the top level result is that we have a 12 to 13% reduction in recorded site visits and e-commerce revenue after the GDPR. Now, the operative word here is recorded. And so the challenge we have is that we could either see a reduction in data because the GDPR is actually harming websites, which is certainly a concern that we would have in evaluating the policy. But more simply, we could just lose data because if users don't consent, we're going to have less data flowing to Adobe servers. So, these two are, they're different in their economic consequences and also in the consequences for how we understand the impacts of this policy. And they're also a challenge from an identification problem because you've fundamentally got two things that are moving that are affecting a single data point. And so we are going to try to make progress on this difficult identification problem using a bounding approach. So try to make, I think, fairly weak assumptions. And when we do that, we get a non-consent rate, which is in a ballpark to where we'd expect it to be, so between 4 and 15%. And then we try to measure as conservatively as possible what could be the real effects of the GDPR on these websites. And we see a minimum of about 0.5% reduction in page views and e-commerce revenues that we think is plausibly the case. And finally, one concern that we might have in this policy, and certainly is your lived experience as Europeans, is that you now see this explosion of privacy notices across the web, which could be kind of irritating and prevent users from actually browsing websites. We don't see any evidence of that, at least in 2018. So today I want to talk a bit about the GDPR, talk about this data, our results. The high-level results are going to be with respect to these recorded web outcomes. I think the most interesting thing is to talk about these different mechanisms, about why we might think that there's these changes in the data, and then we'll bring it together and conclude. So first, with the GDPR, this is at the heart of the GDPR is a quite expansive definition of personal data to be any data pertaining to unique individuals or households. So this is going to include cookie IDs and IP addresses. And the GDPR has a pretty long list of requirements for firms, but I think the highest level takeaway is that it's going to increase the logistical cost and the legal risk associated with processing consumers' personal data. And so increase the cost, we expect a reduction in use of personal data that goes along with that. We're going to use the enforcement deadline of May 25th, 2018 as a natural experiment to evaluate the policy. And the geographic scope of the GDPR is quite expansive, and that creates challenge for inference in this case. So it's definitely going to apply to EU firms. It's also going to apply to non-EU firms that are targeting EU residents. So the focus in our study is going to be the impact on EU residents. And one interesting institutional feature of the GDPR is that the enforcement is split between countries and the EU-wide regulator. And so we might see, despite the GDPR's intent to harmonize regulation, we might see some interesting country-level differences. And finally, we're interested in studying this regulation because it is, I think, a landmark or generational shift in privacy policy, one that affects your entire continent or most of your continent, and one that's also been an inspiration for privacy laws globally, including in the United States, Brazil, Japan, South Korea, and elsewhere. So one of the key elements of the GDPR is that it specifies several legal bases for data processing. And the one that's going to be important in this case is going to be consent. The regulators have clarified that, I would say repeatedly clarified, that websites should be attaining consent for various web technology purposes, including using analytics providers like Adobe and Google. And at least on paper, the individual consent requirements are quite onerous. You're supposed to have informative consent, so no pre-check boxes. You have to tell the consumer the purposes of the data processing, list all the third parties, and keep a record of that consent. Now, the GDPR literature has grown quite a bit here in the last 3 years. So kind of focusing on the general impacts of the GDPR and the ones that are more specific to the web. In general, there's some studies showing that the costs for firms were quite high. I really like this Judge and Wagman paper showing that there's a reduction of, I think it was about 25% in tech venture investment, which is pretty disconcerting. And you see it more in places you'd expect the GDPR to operate. So personal data uses in particular. This other study by Jansen and co-authors shows a pretty dramatic effect on the app marketplace. So a third of all apps are exiting and app entry falls by 30%. And then turning to the impacts on the web, there's a really nice Guy Aridor and co-author study that I think is quite complementary to the one that I'm presenting today, looking at several websites that are using an online travel intermediary and showing a reduction of 12.5% in observed consumers. And they're attributing that to consent, but it's very much a similar story to our own. And then these other two papers here, as I said at the beginning of the talk, they're quite complementary. They're both looking at the effect that the GDPR has had on market concentration, studying the impacts in the web vendor industry. So basically who's using cookies and which vendors websites are using to make their sites operate. And we basically arrive at similar conclusions with the same data. Or sorry, we will arrive at similar conclusions with different data. So that's been, I think, pretty interesting too. And then these last few studies generally are looking at the impact that, as we did on third-party cookies and on vendor uses. So moving now to the data section, we think that this data set is really exciting. In fact, governments are more and more turning to private data to try to gather granular insights to their policy problems. This Adobe Analytics data, I think Adobe has been a fantastic partner. They're used by many governments and many divisions of governments. So in the US, they're used by the Bureau of Labor Statistics, the Federal Reserve, and the Census Bureau. Within academia, I think the only other paper that's made use of this data is Goolsbee and Klenow. So I know the two of them are doing work on studying inflation with the really granular pricing data you can get with this data. The data set is really quite large and covers an important part of the economy. So every week, in terms of EU activity, we're observing 4.4 billion page views. We're observing $750 million in e-commerce revenue. And that is something like 12% of the EU total. Now, we get to look at a large and diverse panel of 1,084 online analytics dashboards. That is, the unit of analysis is a little bit unusual, that it's online analytics dashboards rather than firms or websites. And that's just because there's a many-to-many relationship between domains and probably not companies, but certainly domains and dashboards. So one reason for this is that if you're IKEA, you can imagine creating a dashboard for IKEA France and IKEA Sweden and IKEA USA, in which case you'd have 3 separate dashboards. Or you could imagine having a single dashboard for your entire firm. So, we take great care to avoid duplicates and to do a lot of data cleaning here. But we think even if it isn't a many-to-many relationship, firms are dividing these things in ways that make sense for their business. And so this unit of analysis is, I think, still an interesting one to consider. So we see a lot of different industries. We see finance, health, travel, news media, retail. So some of our websites are e-commerce websites. About a third of them are e-commerce websites, which means that we get to observe their revenue figures. And others are more kind of publishers, I guess, or just even corporate websites. And we get good representation. We have 77 of the top 1,000 websites, and we also get to see a lot of the long tail websites, so 700 below the top 100,000 global websites. And we get to see this weekly for the first 3 quarters of the year in both 2017 and 2018. So I want to map out for you what this data looks like, because it is, I think, very rich and allows us to do some interesting things. So at the beginning, we've got users that are arriving at websites, and that initiates a website visit. And as I say, this data is quite rich, so we get to know where the user's from, which is both in terms of the locational sense. So we get to see that we can differentiate between EU traffic and non-EU traffic, which is very helpful for our purposes. But we also get to see where these users are coming from. And that's, anticipating one of the directions we're going to go with this paper is we expect the GDPR to have impacts on personalized advertising, media like display ads and email. And so we're going to use this measure of where a user is arriving at the website from as a signal of the impact of the GDPR. And so when they arrive on the website, they can essentially just arrive at the website, get what they came for and leave, in which case this is referred to as a bounce. And so the share of visits, this would be the bounce rate. Or they can continue browsing the website. In either case, they're going to be generating page views. And so we're going to be focusing largely on the page views metric. We're going to think that the bounce rate metric is interesting and indicative of the potential nuisance that these consent pop-ups have. And then for the set of e-commerce websites, we're going to see purchases. And so this will be our second key metric, the impact on revenue. Now, what I've shown you so far is in a happy world prior to the GDPR, where we get to observe whatever data the firm is sharing with us, and they're incentivized to share essentially all their data with us. Now, after the GDPR, the picture gets a little bit more complicated. So essentially, we are observing the same outcomes, but at first it has to go through this filter, which is, does the user consent or not? If the user consents, we get to see all these outcomes as before. If they don't consent, then it just goes into a black hole. We have no ability to observe that. And so that creates, as I say, a real challenging problem for inference in this paper. So let's begin by trying to convince you that there is a high-level effect of the GDPR on recorded web outcomes. So this is the volume of data that Adobe is consuming, which again could be due to a combination of consent and a real effect of the GDPR. So to do this, we are going to take a panel differences estimator, which is basically a difference in differences estimator on the same set of units. Now, this is a hard policy to study because we are trying to study something that impacts all of Europe in 2018. And in fact, these other research has shown spillovers of this research, not spillovers of this research, but spillovers of the GDPR to other parts of the world. So finding a control group is a challenge here. One thing we do for robustness is we look at several control groups, but our favorite estimator looks at European outcomes in 2017. So that's going to be our control group, and our treatment indicator is going to be this post May 25th date. And then we're going to have this model, which looks exactly like a difference in differences approach, and we will see, whatever this break is, we're going to attribute to the GDPR. Now, I think that another virtue of using Europe in 2017 is that we'd expect some seasonality, and we don't want to tell you that the effects of the GDPR is to reduce page views and revenues on websites if a lot of Europeans are going on holidays in the summer. So we're able to account for this European seasonality. And what's more, because we're using the same unit of firms, if 20% of our firms are surfboard shops and 30% are ski shops, then we're going to have some seasonality that's unique to those firms and to the sort of products that they sell. And so we're going to have that in the data as well. So with this estimator, we look at the effect on log of page views and log of revenue. And we get these high-level estimates, which are highly statistically significant. And in marginal effects terms, this translates into 11.67% reduction in page views and a 13.26% reduction in revenues. So, this seems like a lot, but again, we temper this with the fact that some of this is due to consent, we expect. And then, for what does this mean in terms of size? Well, for the median firm, this is like 15,000 page views and $9,000 in revenue, both per week. So as I said, we look in terms of robustness. We compare alternative control groups. We also look at a synthetic control approach, and we get, again, this pretty clear and consistent message of a reduction in web outcomes, recorded web outcomes. So, I'm largely focusing in this talk on the main effect, but I think that there's a couple indicators of heterogeneous treatment effects that should concern us. So the first is a competition concern. As I said, there's been other research by myself and others showing that there tends to be a larger effect on smaller firms due to the GDPR. So we find that as well. The large websites have this positive interaction, which is not quite significant for page views, but is significant for revenues. And that is a potential concern. One mechanism for that is that it may be harder for small firms to get consent from users than large firms, because the large firms are larger and have stronger brands and maybe more trusted. And we do have some evidence in the paper that does suggest that consent rates are driving this. So this is one concern about the GDPR. And the second thing is, as I said, we looked at differences in websites in terms of the countries that their users are based in. Work by these Judgian and Wegman and by our other papers suggests that that there is a larger effect of the GDPR where the data regulator is thought to be stricter. So, pretty broadly, the regulator in let's say the Netherlands and Germany and France is thought to be more feared than the regulator in Greece and Hungary. And so a pretty robust finding in the GDPR literature is that there's larger effects where there's greater regulatory strictness. And so we find that as well here. There's a negative interaction with regulatory strictness, suggesting a larger effect there, which is, again, significant for both page views and revenue.
Sorry, Garrett, just a small question about the seasonality. I totally understand that certain categories, for example, travel, are really affected by the seasonality because, probably during the summer or in the Christmas time, we may have a different traffic, right? I was wondering whether you see different types of seasonality, and so the control group that you are using may have different efficacies for different sectors, for example, as I said, travel or health, where we could expect a lower level of seasonality.
That's a good point. I mean, I tried to convince you that using the same set of firms accounts for the seasonal pattern that's specific to that same set of firms. And I think the question is, have we looked at the data to see different seasonality patterns within that? We don't get a lot of, the data within a firm is really rich, but the kind of metadata about what these firms are is not very rich. I mean, we basically have to construct that ourselves. We've done a little bit of breaking things apart into different types of websites, but we pretty quickly lose power. And it's been long enough that I don't recall the seasonal patterns that showed up from that. I mean, we were looking at corporate websites, publishers, and e-commerce websites. So that's probably not at the level where we'd see that seasonality. You probably have to go by industry, which we haven't done. So that's something to think about. Thank you.
Thanks.
All right. So pardon me. So if just showed you the main effect and hopefully convinced you that there's a large main effect here on recording. But of course, the biggest question is why? Because we've got this identification problem where recorded outcomes are the product of the real outcomes and the consent rate, and we expect the GDPR to have an effect on both. And so we want to understand more why this is going on. So here I want to lay out, I think, 4 of the main explanations for what we think is happening post-GDPR. both in terms of factors on the website side or firm side and factors on the consumer or user side. So starting on the consent rate, one thing you might be worried about is that because the GDPR has increased the legal exposure to these companies, there may be some websites that just stop sharing data with Adobe post GDPR. We're going to rule that out by construction because we're just going to drop any cases where we see data collection ending. And there's not very many of those in any case, but we want to rule that out because that's probably the least interesting explanation. Of course, on the consumer side, we expect that some consumers are going to say that they no longer want to be tracked. Now, what we're going to leverage here is that we think that there's a, as economists, we think that there's going to be self-selection in that. We expect that the users that consent are going to be different in terms of their quality, and we're going to leverage that to make progress, as we'll see in the last quarter of the talk. Now, in terms of the effect on real outcomes, in terms of the website, we expect that this policy is going to make it harder to do personalized marketing. We've heard that firms kind of called their email lists in response to the GDPR, and we're a little bit more tepid about using online display advertising. And so we get a sense of where consumers are coming from when they arrive at the website. We expect to see a larger signal there, and we do. And then finally, one thing that we might be concerned about is that the pattern of user behavior is going to be affected by this barrage of privacy notices. And so we want to look at that. In fact, that's the first thing we're going to look at. So you guys know more than me that the experience of browsing the web in Europe is now looking more and more like this. So, everywhere you go, there's a stop sign, and that stop sign asks you for consent in more or less nice ways and more or less strictly compliant with the law ways. Many times, especially in 2018, they're basically, having a format like this, basically like say yes. There's no real option to say no, or going back to this example here, say yes or do a bunch of work to say no. So we're going to be concerned that having this experience is going to make it so that some consumers just throw up their hands and decide they don't want to proceed to this website anymore. That's certainly a concern that firms have. This is a concern that the Irish regulator actually mentioned in their report on the subject. So we're going to try to investigate that empirically, because it should show up as an increase in bounce rates, which means that an increase in the share of visits where a consumer views a single page on the website. So we look for this in the data, and pardon me, there is no significant effect. So this is actually, you should read this as on a 100 basis point rather than a 1 basis point level. So I think we pretty precisely estimate within confidence intervals with a width of 0.6%. For dashboards, and I guess a little over 1% for e-commerce, that there's a null effect here. There is, in fact, the point estimate is negative rather than positive. So we find this thing, and I think this is actually important, that at least in 2018, there doesn't seem to be this increase in bounce rates that is concerning firms and concerning the regulators. But it still probably is irritating European users, as you can attest. So we are going to then simplify our story to be one of a combination of consent and some real effect of the GDPR. And in terms of consent, there's, consent means different things to different people. So the law says that consent, as I said at the beginning of the talk, needs to be a strict opt-out. That's kind of the de facto reality. The de jure, or the on-the-ground reality of the GDPR in 2018 is an opt-out regime. So opt-out regime where it looks like this. You can agree to continue on our website, or you could do a bunch of work to signal that you don't consent to data collection, obviously introducing friction so that the consent rates are high. And the consent rates are actually high. So the Quantcast is the largest vendor. They're the ones that are basically responsible for this kind of model here. And their consent rates, they've said, is in excess of 90%. Is this strictly compliant with the GDPR? I would say no, and the regulators actually tend to agree with me there. And then, what would that look like in terms of Adobe's view? Well, you'd see a reduction sub 10% in the number of data that's coming your way, we'd expect. Now, as I say, the alternatives is to take a strict opt-in approach. This is where, this is a picture from the ICO in Britain after they decided to follow their own law. And they made it so that the consumer has to click on so that you would be able to see these analytics cookies. And through a freedom of information request that someone else did, we were able to see the impact of this on their Google Analytics data, and it just cratered. It fell by over 90% pretty much the next day. And that's because, something like 10% of consumers are going to click these things. So this, is strictly compliant with the GDPR, but you would see just a nuclear effect on the analytics data that you collect. So that's all to say that the effect sizes we're going to see in the consent level are going to be informative of the sort of consent regime that is taking place for our firms. So, going back to our main effect, kind of on an index basis, prior to the GDPR, we've got 100 out of 100 page views per week. Post GDPR, this is falling by about 12%. And we've got this problem of, it's going to be some part of this is going to be a consent effect, some part of it's going to be a real effect. And so I'm parameterizing the consent effect to be theta and the real effect to be delta. And the frustrating thing is that it's still very hard to make, it's impossible. It's an impossible identification problem. And so, as I say, we're going to try to make some assumptions to make us to get some progress on this. The first assumption is a separability assumption. So we're going to make, the expectation, so the recorded outcomes are going to be denoted by Y. The intensive margin, meaning the number of page views per visit, is going to be lowercase y. And then the extensive margin will be the number of visits, which we're going to denote by N. And, mechanically, capital Y is equal to small y multiplied by N. We're going to make a separability assumption here, just basically to help us do power. And the separability assumption is okay in the data, maybe a little bit stretched for the largest firms in our data, but is going to allow us to look at this margin and try to decompose what is the effect of the GDPR. So this, buys us a little bit of power and also buys us this, very simple functional form relationship between theta and delta conditional on our GDPR estimates. So this is going to create like an identification line rather than an identification region. And just kind of walking through the math, we have that the expected number of page views is again this separable function under this assumption, and then post GDPR, it's going to be multiplied by this effect of the GDPR on visits via consent and the effect on the real effect as well. So, even, at this stage, we have made at least one simple assumption, but we're still not able to make progress. So where we're able to make progress is we're going to use this notion that we think the people that provide consent are selected and that they are going to therefore differ in terms of their quality. And to examine that empirically, we're going to look at their usage outcomes. So like their page views or revenues per visit. So here I'm showing you the page views per visit, which on average is 4.47 prior to the GDPR. There's an increase after the GDPR. We think that that's because there's some favorable selection where users that are consenting have a greater affinity to the website. So here we can do a bit of math, and I can say at the beginning of pre-GDPR, there's a mixture of users that are creating this average. There's a set of users that would consent and their usage, and the set of users that would not consent and their usage. And post GDPR, we drop all the consent users. So we know that it's just a function of the usage among the consenting users. And here we can do a bit of math and solve for theta. And that's going to give us a relationship with these quantities. Now, even there, we're not able to get all the way home. And that's because 3 of these quantities are observed. So we observe the usage prior to the GDPR and post GDPR among consenting users, but we're not able to separately identify these guys, which is the users that would have not consented prior to the GDPR. We don't know what these guys are. So how are we going to make progress? Well, we're going to take a bounding approach and just say that, like, you cannot have fewer than one page view for visit. And so that's going to allow us to create a lower bound for theta. And what's kind of nice about this, the challenge with bounds is that sometimes you can drive a truck through the identification region. What's kind of nice is that this is informative enough because, the average is like 4.4. So this strict minimum of 1 is going to be informative. Whereas if this was like 100, then that would be less useful. And then the upper bound, just tautologically, is going to assume that the entire GDPR effect is due to consent. So again, to make progress here, that's going to require that there is some impact on the usage level or the page views or revenues per visit level. And we do see this. So we see significant evidence of an increase in page views per visit and an increase in revenue per visit, which we think is attributable to this consent story. And we can use that to get our implied bounds for theta, which is the consent rate at the visit level, or the non-consent rate, more properly speaking, which, pardon me, for our full set is between 4 and 15%. And for our e-commerce users, our e-commerce websites is between 5 and 17.7%. So just a quick sanity check, we expect most websites are taking the Quantcast opt-out approach. And so we expect the consent rate to be somewhere around 10%. And so this is kind of parked right in the middle there.
Sorry, Garrett.
Yeah, go ahead.
It seems that the bound for the revenue seems to be slightly larger than the ones for the dashboard. Do you have a sense of why this is the case, or is just indeed is not, you think it's not significant, this difference?
It's been a while since I've gone and done this math, but I think the issue is that going back to this thing. So here, the page views per visit can't be lower than 1. The revenue per visit, we're going to say, can't be lower than 0. So that slightly different lower bound can be part of what's contributing to that, and also just what is the effect size here relative to the mean, which I know is, I know for page views because I've given you right here, but I don't remember off the top of my head the mean revenue effect here to give you a relative effect size. So it's a combination of those two things.
Because I would have expected to a certain extent that the consent story should be less relevant for the revenue rather than the page view, right? If a person at the end of the day, decides to use for e-commerce reasons a page, probably has already, the issue regarding the consent. I mean, at least my sensation would be that they are less relevant. But
I think what you're saying is that, like, well, this could be a couple things you're saying. One could be that we expect more selection when you go to the bottom of the funnel, where people are actually giving money to the e-commerce firm. I share your intuition there, and that's where we've got this effect size of 17.2. I think it's in US dollars. And yeah, I should get that relative effect size so that I can better put that in context. I don't have that off the top of my head because that would speak to your question. But there's maybe another part of your question, which is, should we be observing all revenue because, firms should be able to record the revenue. And yes, they're able to record the revenue. However, they're not able to share that data with Adobe without their consent. So that's, one of the, I think that speaks to actually a really interesting question kind of at the core of this research, which is, in some sense, how much should we care about this, given that, like, if there was some real effect of the GDPR on firms' revenue that was catastrophic, surely governments would notice this in the data. And our counterpoint to that is that it's going to be very hard to notice a effect of the GDPR because of its wide effect and with kind of large economy level data. We're going to find actually pretty small effects of the GDPR. And we argue that without this frequent micro level data, it's going to be really hard to pick it up. So, you know, it kind of speaks to, I think, and also a really interesting question. Thank you.
Thanks.
Okay, so now we can create this identification region, which is just a line. So we've got this functional form that says that we are attributing the GDPR's effect to some theta, which is the consent rate, and some delta, which is the real effect of the GDPR. And then you can draw a line that fits that. And we've been able to tighten that identification region a little bit by creating this lower bound over here, using this bound that we have on the amount of selection we can logically have in this case. So we're able to tighten this picture a little bit. And again, we're trying to make the most progress we can with the weakest assumptions. But the total effect this is going to have on page views, because we're mechanically assuming that the consent region at most is on these users with a single page view per visit, is going to be small as a portion of the total effect. It's about 7%. So kind of reminding us where we are in our story, we've convinced ourselves that this isn't going on by data construction. This isn't going on empirically. Consent, there's definitely a layer there, which we totally expect. And so we want to go to this real effect, which could operate potentially through other channels, but we're going to focus on the marketing channel. And so to get there, we're going to use the fact that we get to observe where a user is before they arrive on the website. Now, not all websites are collecting that data. So this is going to be a selected sample of about a half in the case of all websites, and about 2/3 in case of the e-commerce websites. And you can see that, at least based on this metric, which is a last touch attribution metric, that something like 1/3 to 40% of users are arriving directly at the website, a good number are arriving through a search ad, and a relatively small fraction of these users are arriving through a display ad or through an email. So we're going to be focusing on these channels, and this is inherently quite conservative because we expect that, you know, a rule, for instance, of display ads is that you see a lot of banner ads, that increases your awareness or interest in some website like IKEA, but you don't necessarily click on that ad to arrive at IKEA. You could either later directly navigate to that website, or click on a search ad not necessarily a search ad, but use a search engine to arrive at ikea.com or ikea.fr. And so inherently we're understating the rules of these things. And that's something that certainly for marketing perspective, we're concerned about when we think about that data per se. But here we're going to be looking at changes in the shares of these things and saying that if this goes down more than the rest, then that's going to be an indicator of a GDPR effect, and we'll get I think a very conservative measure of that effect. So we go ahead and do this. So here we decompose the effect of the GDPR in terms of these 5 broad channels. And we do see confirmation that there's a larger hit for display, both in page views and in revenue. Oh, I'm bouncing around, pardon me. Email is a little bit, is fairly similar, but again, there's wide confidence intervals for page views, but certainly on the revenue side, we see about twice as large of an effect as on direct traffic. And so the approach we're going to take, again, to be conservative here, is to basically say, well, we expect that some of this effect is due to consent. And there's a larger effect here. And so instead of saying that the whole effect here is due to the GDPR, we're going to basically subtract off the effect on direct traffic. So we're going to say the direct traffic is going to tell us the consent effect. And so any reduction above and beyond that, we're going to attribute to the GDPR's differential effect on personalized marketing. And so we go and do that. Yeah, go ahead.
Sorry, I was wondering, do you have an interpretation for this difference and what we observe, for example, on social media when looking at page views and revenues? because it is quite big, the difference. So you have a null effect in the case of revenues, and then you have a minus 0.2 in the case of page views. Do you have indeed an interpretation?
So on the social part of it?
Yeah, on the social, yeah.
Yeah, we've racked our brains a little bit on this. One thing that could be happening is that there's a reallocation of marketer budgets to other channels that are less affected by this. And so if that were to be the case, then maybe we'd see a smaller effect on search, and that's directionally going in that way. And we may see the same thing for social, but I think you're pointing to the fact that these are going in opposite directions for the page view sample than the revenue sample. So some of its power, right? We've got very wide confidence intervals, but yeah, I wish I had a more satisfying answer for you there. That's a frustration we have with digging into this.
Perfect. Thanks a lot.
Sorry, I have one question about the definition of direct traffic. So do you include in this? So it's just if I put the exact URL in the browser navigator, or do you also include in this referrals from other web sites?
That's one challenge is like there is some referral traffic, and I think we did actually throw that in under direct, if I recall, because there's just a small share of that, and so we needed to do a little bit of aggregation here. But typically it's going to be direct. And just for those of you that are less familiar with this kind of data, the way that this works is that you've got a URL, and then at the end of the URL, there's information about the channel that's the user's clicking on. And that's something that marketers have to do a little bit of work on. So when they're creating an email marketing that they're sending out to their users, they are typically going to have the regular URLs that those things are pointing to, but they're going to add this declaration at the end that says, this is from the email marketing campaign that went out on this day. And so marketers have to do a little bit of work. And that's part of why, we're not observing this for everybody, or not everybody's sharing this with Adobe or data provider. But that's how we know this. And so I think part of the question is saying this becomes a bit of a grab bag, especially if you aren't adding that information correctly to your URLs to make this happen. And so the other thing we've done here is we're focusing on channels that are reporting dashboards that are reporting at least 3 of these channels. So that's, an indicator that these websites are taking this way of tracking traffic more seriously.
Okay, that's interesting that you mentioned the technical aspect, because I think one aspect is, but since you mentioned that referral traffic is not big, but I think over this time period, there's a rise in the use of the no referrer property for the rel attribute in HTML. So it's basically something where if you include this attribute in your links, the website that receives the traffic cannot tell that you sent this traffic, and it will be recorded as direct traffic. So it's potentially challenging, and people have started to use it more, especially since 2017, because it also prevents some exploits that you can do regarding browsers. So, but if it's, I guess if ex ante it's already not a big share, then it's probably not a big problem.
Yeah, we should talk afterwards, because I'd like to dig more into the data.
I just wanted to say maybe in 5 minutes, something like that. Then such that we can have more questions later. Just sorry to stop you here. Just wanted to make a timing.
Yeah, no, that's good. I think we're tracking pretty good for time with some questions in between. I've got I think 2 or 3 slides left. So, but yeah, let's talk afterwards. I'd be interested to see more data on that. I know that there's some browsers that are saying that this click information is privacy informative. So I know Safari is trying to stop this information, and Apple's trying to stop this information from being shared. Much of that has happened more recently. But yeah, this referral traffic thing, again, was kind of a frustration where it was quite imprecisely measured. And so there was not a clear story there, which was my recollection. Okay, so just kind of reminding our brains what the exercise was. We're going to make two assumptions, which are going to boil down to saying that the effect on direct traffic is going to identify the consent effect, and the effect on display and email over and above that is going to tell us the real effect of the GDPR. And so when we do that, we get small effects for two reasons. One is that we're being extremely conservative here in a few ways, and another is that the share of users that are coming from these two channels we're picking is quite small. And so the effect is about a 0.5% reduction, which we think is the real effect of the GDPR. That's about 8% of our total estimates. And so for the median firm, this is about 1,000 page views per week, or $600 per week. So, you know, these are small effect size, but I think quite conservatively estimated. And just to conclude, so we find evidence of both the real and a consent effect of the GDPR. And I think it's worth highlighting that this is in a market equilibrium of pretty low compliance with the GDPR, at least in terms of strict compliance. So, you know, yes, we're finding small effect sizes, but, you know, this is in a world with very low enforcement of the GDPR and a very low strict compliance. So I would not sort of just say that this is small effects, therefore we shouldn't worry about the GDPR. You know, part of the virtue of a law ought to be that people are following it. And, you know, obviously these personalized marketing channels are valuable to sites. Now, on the non-consent side, we are finding non-consent rates, which are about what we'd expect for an equilibrium where most websites are having an opt-out consent regime of about 10%. This is not a fully victimless crime either. So, you know, sites actually collect this data because it's useful to them. And there's a really nice paper by Ayala Disraeli and Ron Berman showing that this kind of data helps websites to increase their revenue. And secondly, if you're not getting consent for site optimization, you're certainly not getting consent for advertising personalization. And we have some other research showing that without cookies, monetization falls about 52%, which is broadly consistent with the literature. So, you know, if this is a website with advertising, take these numbers, divide them in half, and that would be the potential effect on advertising revenue. So again, the bottom line here, a modest effect on data collection, which ostensibly was the intended impact of the GDPR to reduce this by quite a lot, but some small and real harms to websites. So great, we've got 10 minutes for questions, and thank you for the questions I've already gotten.
So thanks a lot, Garrett, for your presentation. We will now stop